I picked up the first non-dual book I picked up, if you want to call it a non-dual book, was Intro to Buddhism. And the one line in there struck me. I don't remember the rest of the book. I don't remember the author. But the one line was, "This moment is the absolute truth." Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I didn't know that in the beginning. And so as I went to other books, I found practices. And one of the first practices that I found are pointers to show. I'm going to show you the inside out path, but through my own journey, and also by voicing the unconscious as I talk about my own practice in the past. Voicing the unconscious that I could not hear at the time that I was doing these practices and listening to these teachings. I couldn't hear the unconscious. I didn't know what it was saying, and it was controlling the spiritual path. That sounded so dramatic, but here, you want dramatic? It was controlling my life. The unconscious controls our life. So it's, I don't know, a little bit, I'll forget the word there. But look, it controls the spiritual path too, but we don't know it because it's unconscious. We can't hear it. It's programming that is in our bodies, recorded in our bodies from the experiences that we've had, especially childhood, the childhood development years. Holding back emotions that are true for us as a child, anger, fear, hurt, whatever, holding it back, not knowing that we're holding it back. That's the thing about repression. It's unconscious. So we don't know we do that. We hold back what's true for us, and then we spend a lifetime. This is the trauma research that tells us this. A lifetime transferring that to every relationship. So now we're holding back those emotions. We're holding back what's true for us in all relationships, and then we're identifying with what's false. We're forced to identify with what's false because we're holding back what's true. I'm just using those words because what's true just means these are authentic emotions that are coming up or would have come up in a moment, but you can't. Don't shut it down. When you're a child, it isn't safe. Mom says, "Stop crying." And, as a little kid, you don't know any better. You don't know I'm just crying. I'm upset, and you're just telling me to stop. So you might suppress that emotion. You have to. Your mind and body, when you're a kid, has to get involved and just stuff that down somehow. You don't really know. You're just surviving in that moment. Or, you better not throw an anger tantrum. So you learn not to. Or in the face of an angry father, you can't get angry. So, and you don't even know that you can't get angry as a kid. It's not even on the table, is it? With an angry father, like, oh, let me think about getting angry back at dad. No. And if you do that, then something bad can happen, as you know, and things bad happen to people who do that, kids who do that sometimes. So this is our emotional system, and it's totally involved in our development. And then because we can't allow everything that is true for us, we have to then spend a lifetime identifying with what's false, which means there comes the suffering. Life is suffering. Speaking of just awakening in Buddhism, life is suffering. But it's the trauma. So the inside out path was not in my life when I first picked up my first non-dual book, Intro to Buddhism, that said, "The present moment is the absolute truth." I was so moved by that line that I went and got other books, like a bunch of books. But the ones I want to talk about are the books and the teachings that gave me really, I think, common pointers that I used and that were helpful. And that's the thing. It's like a paradox. Can we just acknowledge that there's a paradox here? That these pointers and these practices and these Easterns are helpful. On one hand, they're just helpful. Very, actually. They're transformative, You have deep states of realization with pointers and meditation and mindfulness, like deep states of realization. And I did. And I suggested. I suggest meditation, mindfulness. I just don't suggest bypassing while you do it. But then the paradox is, the flip side of it is, there's a bypass in there, a massive bypass in it. And I hope that I can illuminate it here in this video by voicing the unconscious and talking about my own journey. So one of the next few books I got was like Eckhart Tolle's book, and I extracted the 6 things that I thought he was saying to do. So I was like, the power of how, not the power of now. So that way I saw it. Show me how, Eckhart. And there were like 6 things in there. And this has nothing to do with Eckhart, because these are things that he learned from his teachers, and that these are things you might learn in a Buddhist Sangha or a mindfulness retreat or something. I just learned it from his book. One was, I can't remember all 6, but one was watch thoughts. Instead of just thinking the thoughts and believing your thoughts, stop, notice, being aware, and just watch thoughts, observe, and allow them. So incredibly helpful. There's the paradox. On one hand, totally helpful. The moment I first did that, when I was in my room in Indiana, I was an attorney, and I had this law office, if you can imagine, this big long building in a downtown Mount Vernon, Indiana, a really typical Midwestern downtown. If you can imagine, old buildings and all this, they were built in like 1880 something or something, just amazing. I had this little law office downstairs, and I'm with my then husband upstairs, but he's working. But I have this little apartment upstairs, and I'm doing all my spiritual practice in this apartment upstairs and in the town and around and wherever I'm going. And then practicing law during the day and doing mindfulness practice and all this during the day. So yeah, I can't downplay the fact that a regular mindfulness practice or a regular meditation, a regular resting as awareness or practice is so incredibly transformative. Can I say that? Side of the paradox. Do we have that yet? That awareness is a big part of this work. I suggest it, a practice of it, totally. And then the flip side of it is, here's what I learned when I picked up that pointer to watch thoughts. No, I didn't learn it then. You see, I've learned it now through the KI that has made the unconscious conscious, but I didn't know it then. Let me go back and tell you what it would be like if I would have been able to hear the unconscious. And by the way, this is what it's like for you now. If you're listening to these pointers or doing these practices, now you have KI. And I'm even if you don't hear this in your unconscious, you can do KI and discover it. These kinds of things that are happening, programming, quietly in our experience. So whatever you do, don't believe me, and don't just sit here and trust me and all that. And like, oh, Scott said this, Scott said that. Because that's not what I'm looking for. If it matters to you, what I'm looking for is not agreement, but invitation to see this for yourself. So just watching thoughts, you don't hear the unconscious. So the experience back then was quiet a lot, in the middle of the day, even practicing law. I was a solo practitioner, and it was just me and my assistant there in the office. A lot of quiet time. So I'd stop from writing a brief or something and just watch thoughts, or just hear the mind and observe it, and also notice the energy of emotion. This is first dimension. And just sit there and allow whatever feeling is there and watch the thought and just let it be there. And other thoughts that come through, let those be there. Just like meditation right in the middle of life. Feeling down in the body and just letting that be. And coming back to that over and over through my law practice every day and at night and always. Over and over. Coming back to noticing and watching thoughts, incredibly helpful. But here, what I didn't know is that the unconscious, because I had been an anger repressor all my life, there had been programming since I was a kid, mind-body programming, buried in the body, that was saying this while I was watching thoughts. I'll do it together. Here I'm watching a thought that says like, oh, I'm unlovable. Or whatever it's saying. And I feel energy with it or something, or maybe an emotion. I just rest with it. But the unconscious is saying, frankly, the programming of the unconscious would be saying right there, that's safer than the anger. Don't feel the anger. Don't, no, keep it down, keep it down. Or something like that. It's scary. I'm afraid. I can't. Like that kind of energy in what we would call, the researchers call, a continuous trauma response that's unconscious under everything. Especially when you're feeling somewhat of a trigger and you actually feel that thought in your body, like I'm not good enough or I'm unlovable. And especially if you're observing it even, Just like Eckhart said, or any Buddhist teacher might say, mindfulness teacher might say, just tend to what arises. Allow that. But see, right under that, especially with deficiency story thoughts, because we know now from KI that deficiency story thoughts like, I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, there's something wrong with me, blah, blah, are directly tied to emotional repression, because that's the false identification that we are forced to identify with, that because we have to hold back what's true all of our lives. And there it is in our lives, that feeling of lack, or feeling that something's wrong with us, that gets heightened in a trigger in relationship, right? And then if we observe, like Eckhart says, it's helpful on one hand because it shows us that this, whatever is surfacing, comes and goes to awareness. And I'm the awareness. And I would just notice that. I wouldn't even say it to myself most of the time. It would just be rest and let that be. Quietly observing and allowing. And noticing the presence is here. When something would fall away, so helpful. Keep it. Keep that. But when you're triggered, or when you see certain thoughts, let's talk about trusting the body. In KI, we talk about the inside-out path, trusting the body and noticing the difference between thoughts that sort of are what we might call monkey mind, just random kind of, I'm going to get a glass of tea, this. We'll talk about where all that comes from later. But in the beginning, just watch and do as Eckhart says, watch thoughts. Feel the emotion, allow that with it. I even say that, like, if you're going to sit and observe, or just be and observe, notice how thoughts, just as you notice them, they slow down. And the feeling kind of slows down, and you can just let it be with it. It's really helpful. But then right there, the unconscious is saying, well, that's safer. Don't go to the anger. And see, but at the same time, because this is coming up, I am angry. I'm angry because if that anger is my repression, that's what's repressed in that moment. So the unconscious conditioning is, while I'm observing a thought, this is what's it. So the bamboozle in our relationships is that I might be witnessing a thought that says I'm unlovable with my then husband back then, right? Just witnessing that thought or something. In awareness, thinking, oh, I'm so awake to what is. And there he is in the other room. And then my unconscious is like, I am angry at him. I'm really angry at him, but I can't. I will not. And there's the repression. And so when the story comes up, I'm unlovable, there's an aspect of that repression that is simply, there's a hierarchy, if you will, of safety in terms of programming in our system. Identities are simply safer than rage or anger or hurt or buried stuff like that, fear. Safer is all. There's suffering in the identification. There's suffering in I'm unlovable, right? We all agree with that. That's true. But it's still safer. It is. And I didn't know that until I went into the area of the repression and trauma. That's why as a teacher, I was so much into the identity, investigating the identity, because I was in a bypass and didn't understand the roots of that are in the body and trauma and repression. So understanding just that, thank you, Eckhart, for that, and all those teachers and those traditions for that contribution in the world. That is an important contribution. Watching thoughts from awareness, just observe and allow. Because that's the whole process of identification, just as Ken Wilber has said, and this applies very much to KI, is that something that we're identified with and unconscious to then arises to awareness, we observe it. Now it's an object in awareness. Instead of I am that, that's arising in me. I allow that, and then that falls away. And that's what Ken Wilber is saying is universally the process of a waking up, or, yeah. And so Eckhart has it totally right. All those teachers, wonderful contribution. And then just as Ken Wilber says, I have the same criticism. And mine is a criticism of the practice more. Maybe his is more of a criticism of the context and the practice. I don't know. Mine's a criticism of the practice, because in the practice of just watching and observing, first of all, the repression programming that you'll discover in KI and the trauma programming buried in the body doesn't arise to awareness to be observed. That's a problem, a big one, because then it remains in the body throughout years of spiritual practice, continuing to produce shadows, which they've studied in Buddhist monasteries and different places. Shadows continue with people with long-term meditation practices. And so does anger and other repression. That's something that Ken Wilber has talked about. And here's a living example of it. 3 diseases after the awakening experience, 3 diseases, all of which have scientifically been linked to emotional repression. Okay, so there's that, and then another one from Eckhart's book. But again, it's not about Eckhart. This has to do with first dimension teachings and practices where you don't prompt anything up, and these are ways of looking at what arises and relating to phenomena or what arises differently, so that you recognize your true nature as awareness instead of identifying with what's arising. All of that is a part of KI too. All of that, great. So in case you're wondering, there's no disagreement there with any of that. But the practice is the issue for me, because, in fact, I really agree with Ken's thing about it's something is unconscious. We identify with it. It comes into awareness. It's an object appearing to me now, me awareness. It falls away, and the identification then, over time or even suddenly, falls away. I no longer believe that. I no longer live with that belief or identity. Totally agree. And love the practices, the Eastern practices, observing thoughts, but now you know the unconscious is saying that. Now, you would think then that we have to go into the body. So teachers like Eckhart, and he's not the only one who says this, but come down and feel emotion or feel the energy of the body without labeling it. Right. Exactly. Because, see, at the conscious level, you could say KI language, we're identified with what's false. So if we can come down, and so we're in stories about really safe emotions, actually. They're not the repression, right? So we definitely want to come down and it's like, if there's sadness that's not repressed, that's actually, we feel it, then can we just feel it without labeling it? It's not repressed. We're feeling that. See, because repressed sadness is different. Repressed sadness feels like a contracted heart, like a closed, tight heart, or a stomach, that's tight, or anger. If you have anger repression in the beginning, it doesn't feel like anger. That's why you miss it. Because by the time you become an adult, it's concretizing into body contraction, chronic pain, as the science says, or something that doesn't look like anger anymore. So we have to remember that when we start out on the path, that we're talking about something that Eckhart's not talking about. He's not talking about repression, not specifically. Ken is getting closest to it there in that field. I think that there may be others, of course, that are talking about this specifically. But the unconscious, what it's doing, and here we're going to talk about what it's doing in spiritual practice, because just coming and feeling an emotion that is not repressed, that is actually being felt, that is not unconscious, is great to not label it, because then you can just let it be within awareness. Totally agree. Great contribution to people's lives. That pointer, I should just build a shrine on some of these pointers, frankly, so that you can understand the paradox that I love and disagree with them at the same time. These are such good pointers. They helped me. I want to be clear about that. And I think that they can help you. But understanding the bypass and the KI context will help you not use these things in certain situations in certain ways. And that's the issue, isn't it? So, for example, anything that's repressed, that's why we identify our primary repression in the beginning of KI, inside out path. Because, see, now we know that if I'm coming down and feeling a contraction and just resting with that, well, I'm not really resting with... See, that's our contractions and our chronic pain, for the most part, are buried emotions. Unless there's a traumatic injury, there are exceptions in the science and in Dr. Sarno's work, that some things are producing, right, some injuries or something are producing chronic pain. But there's a lot of conditions now we have science for, where the pain itself, and certainly contractions in the torso area that we experience on the spiritual path, are emotional repression and trauma programming. Basically buried fear, frozen fear, repressed anger, repressed hurt, sadness, and shame, and other things. But that's it. So there, we want to know that from the beginning because, yeah, if so on my path, let me share my experience. It's easier. Um, so taking Eckhart and all the tradition's advice on that, again, which is brilliant, is for me because I didn't repress sadness much at all or woundedness. So when I got into a dispute with somebody like a husband or a boyfriend, I wouldn't get angry. I'm an anger repressor. Does that surprise you? I can now. So watch it. Just kidding. But I can. But back then I couldn't. And so I could experience sadness. And I did because my system would keep producing that and a feeling of woundedness or hurt because that's safer in my family. My dad used to cry in front of me. It was very sweet. He was a very masculine man. So I learned, that's where I feel like if I wouldn't have been bullied, being a boy girl would have been really natural for me because my dad had both masculine qualities and some qualities that people unfortunately think are feminine. So I don't think that's correct, which is the ability to express emotions. That's really unfortunate. I have to say that on earth that men are so repressed that we say women are the ones that, because emotions are really, there's nothing wrong with them. So if you're more in touch with your emotions, then there you go. Cheers. We don't want to be identified with them, and we don't want to repress or suppress them, though. Remember, that's the difference. Okay. So if it's a repression for me, then first of all, I'm not experiencing anger. You have to remember that. So Eckhart's, he would say then that my contraction was like a pain body, or other, like Adi Da would call it the self-contraction. Ken Wilber would call it the self-contraction. It's a bodily thing when you have repression and trauma. So, but that advice just to rest doesn't work well with contractions because there's too much unconscious conditioning there. That's where the repression is. So, for example, if I'm in a trigger and my husband says something and I have sadness or hurt as an actual emotion because I don't repress that, then yeah, I want to come down and just let that be. Just let it be. Just do nothing with it. No thought on it because I'm not holding it back. It's just coming up. Allow it. Do nothing. Your awareness, there's nobody here. There's where the non-dual comes in. Just be. Be aware and let it come through. Do nothing. But that doesn't work with anger repression or anything that we're actually repressing. Because let's just say that I used to, this is what happened to me all the time. This is part of the bypass, is I would feel the hurt or the woundedness, but of course anger's off limits. So what was left after that would fall away, the hurt and the sadness, the actual emotions, is what would be left is a little bit of contraction. You know what I mean? Because that would have been under it. And I didn't understand then that that's the fear and the anger that hadn't been processed in my life. I didn't understand that contraction was really that. So I would rest with the sadness, just like Eckhart and the other teachers say, without labeling, and it would fall away, or the hurt. There would just be this presence, just like they would say. It would transmute to presence, and all there is presence. With this contraction, wherever it would be. And then I would just rest with that, just like they would say, not labeling that. And that was my mistake, because in that contraction was conditioning that said, by the way, you're fucking angry at him. I mean, angry at him, but you can't. You can't. No, don't. No, hold it back. There's a contraction saying and doing that, essentially. I'm scared to express anger, I'm scared. If I did, I would be ashamed. All appearing as nothing more than a contraction. And I didn't understand that was repression. I just didn't get angry. I think a lot of spiritual teachers who don't get angry are actually just repressed. They just don't know it. You wouldn't know it until you tap into the unconscious real deeply with skillful practice. And it's not meditation. And it's not these practices at all. Because see, right there, we enter KI on contractions, right? We know now, if you've done KI, and if you haven't done, I'll explain to you, is that conditioning that says I'm angry, it needs to be made conscious in those moments. That's what we do. We learn to make the conditioning that's in the background and unconscious conscious. We bring it into awareness. The part that says I'm angry, but we do it in a safe and effective way. It's not overwhelming. It's not controlled either. You can't control anger, but it's brought into awareness with both mind and body. And in that way, when the mind and body agree, in the inquiry, and the mind is expressing it, and you're seeing it in awareness. See, you're witnessing it. It's not just the thought, I'm angry, you're witnessing. We do something different in third dimension KI. I'm not going to get into the tools, but it's an advancement in spiritual practice, what we're doing in third dimension. But generally, what we're doing is making the unconscious conscious. And the unconscious here is not a story. See, so the stories come up, that's the false identification. So I used to identify with I'm unlovable. Well, that's not who I am. Okay, I mean, some people along the way maybe have said, yeah, you're unlovable. But that's beside the point. That's their stuff. I believed I was unlovable because that kept me safe from anger. I didn't know that because I wasn't aware of the unconscious. So when I would get triggered, I wanted to feel anger because I thought, you let everything be, right? By the way, if this video stops because my husband calls or something like that, I will give you a part 2 on this because I don't want to go do this from the beginning. I may give this 2 parts because if you can see all these practices and see how we slip in with inside out, I think it'll make a lot of sense for you. Right here with that contraction, we make that unconscious conscious, and it's not a story. So the stories are the things like I'm unlovable that I used to see and rest and allow with, right? Those identity thoughts, I am this or that. But under that is not a story, it's a mechanism of holding back myself, holding back the emotion of anger especially, and not processing the fear of that and other fears with it. All buried, like frozen in the body and just contraction. See, we enter KI there and transmute that contraction, reverse the repression for a much deeper healing than anything I was doing back then. Much, much deeper in my experience than any of this that I'm talking about. Because I think a lot of these pointers that Eckhart's doing, and rightfully so, are about waking up to awareness, like recognizing that you're not the things that come and go. But these particular pointers are not good for making the unconscious conscious. KI is good for that, but be honest with you, I'm here doing this video to explain to you those practices are not good for that, so that you don't spend years in a bypass that is not necessary anymore. And if you don't figure it out through KI, just figure it out some other way, because you can have diseases and all kinds of things from this, not seeing this stuff. And yeah, that's a whole nother story. Okay. So yeah, we don't just rest with contractions. We don't just rest and do that and just let that be, because we want to investigate that skillfully in practice. But for everything else that's not repressed, and that's why we want to learn our primary repression in KI, the inside out path. We learn what emotions and traits primarily we have been holding back and storing in our body since childhood, with programming that stores it in the mind. Like, I can't get angry. I can't. No, don't. Programming, which is not a story. Remember, so as we make it unconscious, remember, we're making a mechanism conscious. A mind-body mechanism that says, I can't get angry. That's being made conscious, and that's not a story, nor is it any of the stories that you're seeing in awareness, in meditation, because it's a mechanism buried in the body. It's producing the stories, because remember, holding back what's true, and identify with what's false. Okay, so then another practice, the third one from Eckhart's, which again is not really his, it's just the presence is all that it is, pointing to presence. Very common. By the way, I love Eckhart. Eckhart, let's have dinner. I mean that because we never got to have dinner. We were supposed to have dinner one time. We never did. And I'm going to tell you about how I love your teaching. I'm going to tell you how much I adore you. I would date you if you were gay. Did that just come out of my mouth? Don't tell Chester. But there's a big bypass in your teaching, and I'll tell you about it if we have dinner. But I love you. Okay. So another thing that he would say would be, so watch thoughts, feel feelings and then just rest as awareness. And that's certainly not just his pointer. And I've written just 7 books, only 7 books with that pointer as a primary pointer, as just be and allow. The art of letting things be as they are, from and within awareness. All good pointers. Here's the paradox again. On one hand, because it shifts us into recognizing that we are the awareness. But it's not good for making the unconscious conscious, which means it's not good for, in my view, embodying the realization, the awareness, embodying it, bringing it all the way in through the unconscious and making that conscious in the body. But the resting is good. And how would you bring it in KI? So you have to understand when you're resting, this is tricky because you would never hear this, because when we're pointing to awareness, it's often like it's about quietness, and not always. Like when you go to a Neo-Advaita teacher, or some teachers are loud, like Zen masters would be loud and not, they'd be talking, like Nisargadatta would be talking or getting angry or something. But generally, like when we're investigating from awareness, it's a quiet experience sometimes. Meditation, just observing and allowing, right? Even discovering the stillness that's inherently here. And that's true in KI too. There's a stillness that's inherently here, or that's here, you could say. All that. But resting and allowing is tricky because you can't allow what doesn't arise. So in the unconscious is saying, no, I'm not going to feel anger. No. Or, because not everybody has anger as part of their primary. Some people have vulnerable emotions like sadness or hurt as part of their primary. So in this situation, let me give an example. Taking Eckhart and Scott Kelleby's pointer to rest and let things be. There's an unconscious with sadness repression that's saying, no, don't feel the sadness, just stuff that down. Don't cry, don't show them, it's not safe. I'm afraid, don't. That's going on for a sadness repressor while they're resting and letting everything be. And what's being produced is the false identification. Because what's true for them, just KI terms, as a sadness repressor, is that they're sad. That's what's true for them and was since they were a child, or hurt. That's the authentic feeling there for them that they stored and buried. So they have to identify with what's false, which is always a deficiency story for us, or just identity, ego identity. But for a sadness repressor, it might still be like I'm unlovable, like mine, but they might be angrier. See, just getting away from my experience for a second, they might be angry because they might not repress anger as much as sadness. You see how we can experience things differently? We can have the same deficiency story, but experience it emotionally differently. So if I trigger a sadness repressor's deficiency story, they might just come at me, start fighting me. But if somebody would have triggered my deficiency story because I repress anger, I might have just disconnected from you and felt hurt about that. And maybe some anger. But here's the thing with anger repressors. Secretly in my body, in my chronic pain, I was punishing you, disconnecting and punishing you. But that, along with the other unconsciousness, was not conscious at that time. Yeah, so anger repressors, when you walk in the other room, or you're giving any kind of silent treatment, you're punishing. It's unconscious. You can't feel it. I mean, you can feel it, but you might not be able to hear it yet. Okay. So that practice you have to be careful with, because again, you can't be with what's not arising. I always say the repression mechanism is like there's a guy on your shoulder, and it's an unconscious. You can't see him. You're looking this way. He's right here. But it's like if he were talking to you, he's like, I have your back, man. I have your back. Don't worry. We're not going to experience sadness. Now, be with what is. See, but you're bamboozled because you're not being with what is. In fact, the emotion that might be even most authentic for you and has been since childhood, hurt or sadness, you can't go there. There's too much fear. Fear is at the root of all of it. You can't. So you have to identify with what's false. You might have to get angry if that's not repressed. So you see, if you don't see the unconscious right then, or hear it, then you might then rest with the deficiency story, not knowing that that's there because of the buried sadness. And you can't just sit there and throw up the term, I'm sad, because, you can. It doesn't hurt anything. It might help, but this is really deeply buried. You have to understand it takes skill to really bring it up, and it's a mechanism that buries the sadness there. The research calls it a continuous trauma response. Continuous. We're always holding back this emotion. These emotions constant. This is how we show up in the world in every relationship. Okay, so moving on to other practices through the years. Those were my years as a first dimension teacher. I was influenced by people like Eckhart, who did those first dimension practices. Remember the KI map? First dimension spiritual practices when it's an awareness-based practice where you don't prompt anything up. through inquiry. You don't ask an inquiry question. You don't insert inquiry. You just essentially observe, allow, notice, observe, be. First dimension. Those were all first dimension pointers from Eckhart. They come from deep from the traditions. Like, they're old, actually. And I use them. So he got them from other teachers and traditions. I got them from him. So whatever bypass he got from them, I got that from him. I'm not saying that Eckhart represses anger. I don't think he does. But I'm saying that I didn't know I repressed anger, and I picked up these pointers and didn't hear the unconscious there and continue to repress the anger while doing the practice. Then I became a teacher, and I started to do the pointers with others. First dimension, didn't hear the unconscious, didn't see the bypass. So then, also there was a bypass in my life, and the repression. And I went deeper and developed the unfindable inquiries and got into second dimension inquiries generally. That's the living inquiries, the unfindable inquiry. I don't want to name too much other teachings, but it's so obvious. Second dimension means we start prompting something up. So if I sit there and say, what's the worst thing that could ever happen to me? Then something comes up that might not have otherwise come up, and possibly something that was unconscious that we believe. So prompting things up, second dimension, is gold. It's not gold, because I think the third dimension is more gold, but it's so helpful to be prompting things up. And that's what we did, and that's KI. A lot of KI is second dimension. And when you prompt things up, you just witness in second dimension. So it would be like, we have the tool called mining, and that was born in the living inquiries, this tool. It's also a part of other practices, and it's called by different names. But basically, if you feel, for example, some stuck energy or a contraction or even chronic pain, and you just bring awareness to it and rest with it, and then you insert a question like, what does this sensation mean about me? And then stuff comes up in the mind and you observe, remember, witness. This is second dimension. Just allow each thing to be, and notice that you're the awareness. All that comes and goes to you. And you keep asking and other things come up. Or you might say, if this sensation had a voice, what would it say? Things come up. So that's a great practice. It is not good for repression. So try it. Do it. It's good for regulating when you don't really know what something is trying to say. But frankly, we know what these contractions are saying now. It's repression of emotion. So those particular tools are great, except for with the unconscious, not with the repression. Because see, there's a hierarchy of safety in your unconscious. In other words, to your nervous system, identifying with an identity is safer, as we say, than being angry, if that's a repression, right? But what's safer in between that is just repressing the anger. That's safer. And of course, it's even safer to bury that repression, not even know you're doing that, and then identifying with what's false, the identity. See the hierarchy? So the second dimension starts to get into the identification with what's false more, I think. Well, at least in LI and KI we did, is to get to what we call core deficiency or core woundedness, which is, I think, is like the bottom of the barrel for the identity piece, which is I am something, an identity, which is different than I do something or I respond or I feel something. I am something. So things like I'm unlovable. There's something wrong with me. Just a version of that. A version of deficiency. I'm not good enough. I'm unworthy. I'm not supported here. I'm not heard. I'm not respected. I'm nothing. I'm a victim. I'm a loser. I'm unsafe. These kinds of core identities in KI and LI and 2D KI, for those who know the map, we would start prompting this up, and this goes deep, because now as you observe core deficiency identity, you're starting to get the more of the energy up in the body with these thoughts. And the reason that is because you're getting closer to the repression. Because remember, these deficiency stories are a product of the repression. Holding back what's true, identifying with what's false. So if you, for example, if your partner triggers you and you say, boomerang, this is the boomerang tool. What identity or deficiency story comes up for me here? Who am I here? And then something comes up like, I'm nobody to her, just nobody. And you feel that. See, so you have mind and body. And all suffering is mind and body. You're identifying or making conscious the mind part of that here. Then you feel the body. But see, you come down to the body then, and that, I've been calling that, even though we call that a deficiency story or identity up here, I'm nothing. In the body, it's a felt sense. And it's like an emotional deficiency is what I've been calling it in KI. Meaning like we're missing something. Something's missing. We're deficient. And I used to say to people, no, you're not. You're not missing anything. It's just a story. But it's not true because we are missing something. Our emotions are offline. These natural resources of anger, fear, hurt, which we were experiencing, but we couldn't experience when we were a kid, we stored them. They're offline. That creates a sense of deficiency or lack in our adult life that we carry around with us. And then it certainly comes up in triggers. So as we start to investigate deficiency story with KI2D, watch what the unconscious does with that. You can't hear it though until you do 3D. But if you conjure it up and you say, okay, so she's making me feel like I'm nothing to her. So you reverse that. And you start seeing these thoughts that try to prove to you that you're nothing, old stuff with energy on that. You allow it, you allow it, you allow it. And then it comes and it goes in awareness and you feel better, more expansive because you recognize the presence there and all that. But see, the unconscious at the same time is saying, that's safe. That story that I'm nothing, that's safe compared to the buried sadness. Or for my case, it would be the buried anger. So there's the hierarchy of sadness. So the unconscious is saying no to the anger. So here's the thing that's such a bamboozle. Because in that moment, I think that I'm upset because I feel like I'm nothing. But that's not the full thing there. What's really going on with an anger repressor is I am angry at you. I'm angry at you. But anger repressors can't go there until they do the work. They stay in repression. You don't have to say it to somebody, by the way. You can process anger, a lot of it on your own without ever putting anger on people. I was just giving an example there of if you were to able to. Anger repressors can't, usually. So right then, so the body's holding back the anger. You can hear the unconscious there. And meanwhile, in the consciousness, you're just watching identity stories. And that's not the repression. See? So if you keep doing that, and that's what I did in living inquiries, and then at first in KI, just very beginning of it, looking like so many other non-dual teachings, this to me is the crux of the non-dual bypass or the Eastern practice bypass, where we get to this place where we're really seeing these thoughts of who am I? And we're waking up and saying, I'm not that. Only to not realize that the roots of that are in the body. The body keeps the score. And it's all hidden. And so we bypass the body if we're not careful there by staying and investigating identity, which again to the nervous system is safer than the rage, safer than the buried hurt or whatever that is there. And so we have reason to stay there because the trauma programming basically operates on, I'm going to do what I need to stay safe and get love. And so if holding this emotion back keeps me safe and gets me love, it's going to keep happening. And I'm going to be, so to speak, awake, experiencing my true nature, but still I'm not, the ego is still very much here because the repression is the very core aspect of ego. Holding back what's true, repression or suppression, identify with what's false. So you graduate to all these practices, and there's the other ones in there that I try, like the headless way and different things. They're all great. I feel like the world should be integrated. Like all these practices and teachings should just all get together in a big room, and we should just talk and say, yeah, it's okay. Let's all do it together, including KI. But I also know that's not the world that we live in, too. So in the meantime, I'm just going to try to help the people that come to KI or come to these videos, help with understanding this bypass and maybe increase your skill. Okay, so we learn other practices, and I don't want to go into all of them like headless way. But here's the thing. I will say this. I used to sit and listen to teachers who were very, very direct. And again, another great contribution to humanity is like the sort of neo-Advaita or the neo way of doing it, of like, we don't have to sit here and do spiritual practice. That's for egos. I mean, there was a part of me that was like, yes, that resonate with that, because I could be doing this forever. Right? So there's some wisdom in that in terms of recognizing the presence, because the presence isn't going anywhere. It's already here. But to call that liberation, that's a step too far for me, because there's too much unconsciousness for people, most people, to say that because they instantly recognize the presence is already here, that they've embodied that. So it's like everything. What a great contribution. What a limitation to only talk that way. So because at the same time that we're talking that way, if I was a neo-Advaita teacher or that kind of teacher and I said, nothing being everything, right? But the unconscious is saying, well, we're not going to be getting angry now or in the next 10 years. So yeah, anger's not being, nothing's not being anger here. No way. And that's the ego structure. So to say that there's no one there or whatever is the bypass, because yeah, literally there's no one there, but there's programming, unconscious programming that is acts like a self-contraction and comes with suffering and can produce disease and all that. These are all things that I was exposed to. They all helped me. And then there were bypasses in all of them, including my own work, as you can see. So this started to shape the practice. I learned the hard way, because it's not like I caught all this bypass and then corrected it as a teacher. It's that I got sick, 3 diseases. And the third one got so bad I became suicidal, and I was like, I just threw all that stuff away. All those pointers, gone. And I haven't talked about or really been interested in, I got rid of all those kinds of pointers, most of them my news feed on Facebook. It's not that I'm mad at them. It's just that I could forget it. Because the way I see it, here's how I look at it now, is I feel like I would have felt if I would have grown up with conscious parents. That's the best way I can explain it. After doing this work that's best, because it just feels so natural to be yourself. And that's still a process of unfolding, because I had so much repression. But God, it's just so simple. Freedom is. It's just so simple. And it's so much simpler than any of the pointers, as simple as they can be, really are. It's so much simpler than that. Being ourselves is just, it's so simple. And all those years when I would say, or I've heard teachers say, you can't not be yourself. Because whatever's appearing in presence, that's you're it all. That kind of thing did bring up anger during my healing process. When I would hear that or remember that pointer, for some reason that really got under me, because I could just really feel the bypass in that. Anyway, it's not like I got wise to all this stuff. I just got really sick, and I was forced into throwing it all away. And then just starting from scratch and going, what the hell's really going on here? And then healing my own chronic pain, and then discovering this freedom that I couldn't have with those pointers. Because see, again, it feels like if this is what it'd be like if I had conscious parents. So imagine a kid that's not me. Get it away from me, because I don't want you to think about me for this scenario. Imagine some kid out there that grew up somewhere with really conscious parents. What does that mean? It means these parents, all they're interested in is letting that kid be themselves. That's it. And so if there's anger, there's anger. There's sadness, there's fear, there's fear. Done. Sexuality, it's totally okay. It's natural, of course. Whatever makes a conscious parent, whatever. That child would not, technically speaking, would not have to repress or suppress emotions like we did to survive. So they're not going to develop the ego in the same way we did. Certainly the deficiency story, which is the false identification from holding back what's true. So I can imagine that kid, if he turned 18 and he walked into like a typical satsang or retreat, or watched the Scott Killaby video of 2013, or another non-dual teacher that's not aware of this stuff, I can't imagine what that kid would say, because that kid would not, I would assume, would have not had to grown up and done much of like pointing to awareness. Because I think we have to be pointed to awareness and meditate, because we've lost connection with our natural state. And that kid would have just been born and raised into it. His authentic expression too. Not just presence, but his individual expression, conscious, online. So he would go into the satsang and everybody's being pointed to presence, like rest and be. I can imagine that kid would be like, y'all are fucking pissed. You're pissed. And by the way, all this quietness, this is what I'm saying, all this quietness and this focus on peace and all this, you all are fucking angry. A lot of you, not everybody, is bearing anger here. I imagine that's what that kid would say, because energetically he would feel that repression there. Because when you're not in repression, you can feel it so much more. When it's in your body, it feels like pain and suffering and chronic pain and disease. Trauma does. But you can feel that in others. But when you clear yours, it's different, because you become even more tuned into. And if you're an empath, watch out, because when you clear repression, you're really tuned into, and you're clearer on your side, tuned into other people's, and you're not nearly as reactive at other people's emotions as an empath even, because you're finally allowing it all. But see, back then I didn't get to these places. So the inside out came, suicidal ideation. Long story short, let me tell you about it now. What we're doing here, here's the rundown for the inside out path, for those of you who don't know it. Then we're going to wrap it up. I can't promise how many minutes that would be, but I hope this is helpful. Now, those that come here, I think, well, anybody's welcome. I hope you'll send this video to people, and I hope you'll send a little note with them that says, don't expect a normal non-dual teaching talk here. Don't expect that. Just come with an open mind. Send your friends this who are, look, the only way they can deny it is by literally not doing KI and not doing our Are You Repressing Emotion video on YouTube, where anybody can determine whether they have repression. So unless they're just going to completely avoid the direct experience of this, then they're going to have to probably listen, and maybe do some work and explain to them, because there's a lot of biases against this work, because we're feeling what we don't want to feel. And the mind comes up with all sorts of reasons why I'm wrong. Scott Killaby's wrong. Because we don't want to, because the truth is we don't want to feel something, and he's making us feel stuff. I'm not making you feel anything. I'm just inviting you into a journey in which you feeling this stuff can be the source of healing and freedom. But the path here is for people who, I think, hear this kind of video and they go, this is what I need. There's something here that he's saying that, like, I just wish I would have known this a long time ago. If you're hearing that, yes, this is your path. This could be. So come to the members area. That's one way to do it, is go to Killaby.com, and then there's a link there to the Killaby members area, which is a community in which there's videos, sessions, recordings, meetings, where we're showing people how to do the work. I think it's great. And everybody who likes this kind of stuff, if you can afford, like, I don't know how much, it's pretty cheap per month. Great way to just get involved and get started. Killaby members area, training and mentorship. I want to talk about that at the end. So I want to talk about the path. But right now I wanted to invite people, because I know right now there are some people listening who maybe have gotten this video and didn't know about what we're doing here, and your appetite is whet. You can go. You don't have to watch the rest of the video. But if you're going to stick around, let me tell you a couple of things about the path before you come here. We're not just being with what is. I hope that you can understand why, but I like to explain it this way, is that we are really never just being with what is. This is why I include Donald Hoffman's book, The Case Against Reality, believe it or not, as one of the recommended readings for KI. because he explains in there from evolutionary research on how we adapt to survive. They did these experiments and calculations, and the number of times that we adapted to see reality as it really is zero. And he talks about it that way, and it really helps, I think, for the context here to understand that that's exactly what we're experiencing. Only here we're making that unconsciousness conscious. So he's saying we only see what we need to see in order to survive and procreate. But from an interior awareness experience where we're making unconsciousness conscious, what we actually experience in awareness is more like, I have to stay safe and get love. And I do that by holding myself back, holding back what's true and identifying with what's false. So that's a really important part of the inside out context, because under all the trauma and repression conditioning, we're believing in this stuff and responding in this way in life and in relationship because we're trying to stay safe and get love, or in the words of Hoffman, survive and procreate. So you really want to understand that as part of it. And then you understand we're not being with what is. So if, in other words, okay, in this path, we're not just sitting around all day just being with what is. When you're not triggered, when there's not chronic pain going on, or you're not working with body contraction, when you're not in a shadow, and when you're not dealing with any like existential suffering or whatever, and you're just having a day or a period in your life when you're just doing okay, that's when I say investigate awareness with the awareness practices. In parts of the day where you're not really suffering, then just rest and let things be. I mean, are suffering, but not extremely suffering. You're not just mildly, like you have to. It's just a judgment call, because the more there's real suffering in your life, the more I would say go to the trauma. That's the root of it. So in times when you're doing okay, if there's not a lot, then do the rest. Notice, observe, feel the first dimension, like Eckhart type things. But with regard to what we call the forms of suffering in KI and the inside out path, you have to identify the forms of suffering in your life. Some people would say, my whole life is suffering. Well, there you go. Then bring KI to your life. But there are certain forms of suffering that if you can identify them early on the path, like what I call triggers, which are, like something happens and we respond. And the way that we respond is by holding back what's true, what we've historically held back, and then identifying with what's false in the trigger. So that, again, we would go to repression, because there's the traumas running the trigger, the unconscious repression right there. So that's in KI. We go straight to repression inquiry, 3D style. So you want to learn that, or 2D. And that's in the members area, and there's 2D out here on YouTube, actually. So, but things like that, and then shadows, because as Ken Wilber says, shadows are like when there's a trait in somebody else that I'm really either attracted to or repulsed by, because I have that same trait in myself. So that trait could be either too beautiful or too ugly for me to really own, and so I repress it. And all of that is based in emotional repression. We're repressing emotions. And so we also repress the stories and the traits that go with those things. So if I repress anger, I might also repress the trait of power, or the response of power. What do you call power? Or if I repress sadness, I might also repress affection or love, because it's too vulnerable, something like that. So the shadows are like often mind stuff, though. So it's like, she's talking too much, and that bugs me. I really don't like her. But see, the reason that's there is because that's a trait that you have in yourself. Through shadow work, if it's skillful, you end up seeing, oh, either I talk too much, and that's why it triggers me, or I can't talk. I can't allow myself to talk so much. I'm repressed. I hold anger back or something. And so the source of it is emotional repression. We're going to take you to the source when there are shadows. And we recommend that on the inside out path, you learn to make this a lived inquiry, so that when triggers, deficiency stories, shadows arise, be mindful of when they arise, become skillful, and go straight to repression. But other things are different. Like you're just walking through the park and you're not sitting there thinking about really awful things, and you just notice presence, sound. Sound immediately appears to presence. Thought appears. This is why I think retreats can be good, because you can get away from people and just experience presence. But you have to go back into life, and that's where it has to be embodied and lived, right? This is why KI is good for that. So those are forms of suffering. Remember, we're identifying forms of suffering. So a form of suffering could just be like, again, it could be a conversation you had today with somebody. There's a trigger for you. Like they said something and you have some feeling left over around it. So if you do the boomerang, pull the person up in awareness. Feel down into the body. Rest. As you're looking at the person, just say, what deficiency story comes up for me here? And let's just say what comes up is, well, my boss said, I should have gotten that in on time. You were 2 days late. I'm unworthy is what comes up. I feel dejected. Let's say I'm an anger repressor. Remember, you always want to know what your repression is before you start doing inquiry. So that feeling about myself unworthy is that feeling of lack or deficiency. So whenever that's there, go to repression inquiry. That's a form of suffering. Chronic pain is a form of suffering. Anxiety, depression, addiction, form of suffering. Bring KI to those forms of suffering. Because all forms of suffering on the inside-out path are actually pointers to repression inquiry, KI. That's why I say it that way. The inside and outside are one. That's why I say the inside-out path. This means this is a non-dual embodiment path. So that you embody the recognition that the inside and outside are one. When we start in KI, we do somatic testing to discover that in the unconscious in the body, there's already programming of repression and trauma that's responsible for all the suffering, the forms of suffering in your life. Through that somatic testing in the beginning, you become aware, and that becomes part of your context, that you repress certain things and that these forms of suffering that are appearing in your life come from that repression and trauma. And then your practice is shaped and molded in that direction so that you bring inquiry to those forms of suffering when they arise. It takes a while to get your skill to that level because we resist the shit out of these emotions. But it's well worth it because, I'm not going to say, but it's just well worth it because this has been the missing key for me, 100%. Okay, so there's the inside-out path, the forms of suffering. The more skillful you get, I want you to also remember that as you get started, the skills are here on YouTube, but the more advanced skills are in the members area, the better skills. You need more support with the advanced skills, usually. Those are called 3D, third dimension. A form of suffering would also be chronic pain. I want to come back to that. And that includes body contraction. Basically, what we've discovered is both chronic pain and body contraction are so similar. Body contraction is like tight heart or closed stomach, throat, head sensation. Chronic pain would be like migraine, speaking of head. That's why it's so similar. Or even organ issues, like, that could be connected to repression. So we might have a physical disease in an area where we have a contraction. My partner has stomach issues. He also holds his sadness repression in his stomach. I had spine issues. I hold my anger repression, or I did, in my spine. And such. So the line between the physical and emotion just isn't there. Really. So we discovered this in the beginning. Through somatic testing, we learn the programming. We take it to inquiry. We want to start looking for the two markers once we become skillful. So basically what's going to happen is that some form of suffering is going to come up in your life, and you're going to take it to inquiry. It's a form of suffering that's connected to trauma and repression. So for example, a deficiency story or a shadow or something like that. You're going to take it to inquiry. And so when you do, this is repression inquiry, it's like, we call it like coming to the repression barrier. So repression barrier is just this experience of, it's the resistance. It's like, I don't want to feel that anger and I can't express that. That sense of like it's a barrier, I can't. No. So we want to bring you to that and make you skillful there and move through that. over time. It's a process, remember, because this is repression. This is trauma. You have to be skillful, move through it. You're embodying presence is what you're doing. And even though time is not a real thing, that's true. It comes and goes. This is a process. You cannot embody that all at once. Very few people in any generation ever do that. It's a process. So I want you to remember that 2 markers are the most important thing when you learn these skills, because this is what allows you to go deep. The 2 markers are, when you're doing KI at the repression barrier skillfully, you should notice that energy is transmuting. You've heard Eckhart talk about that. Like an emotion or something is there and then it transmutes. But here it's like a contraction transmuting. Because remember, in the beginning of doing KI, if you're an anger repressor, you won't feel anger. If you're feeling anger, you're probably not an anger repressor. In the beginning of KI, if you're a sadness repressor, you're not going to feel sadness from KI for a few weeks. It takes a few weeks to start feeling the emotion that's repressed. That's one thing that people get lost on in the beginning. But if you understand that, you're going to start doing inquiry on, let's say, anger repression, if that's your primary, regularly, every day. When triggers come up and everything, you're going to stay on anger repression if that's your main one, or you're going to stay on sadness repression. We're going to make you skillful there. You want to look for the 2 markers. One is the energy transmuting. So what that means is, like, if I'm repressing anger and I'm starting to make that finally conscious, like I'm angry and I can experience that in inquiry, that contraction that holds that anger, you should see it changing a little bit. Dissolving some, not all of it, but some change in it while it's activated in awareness. This is a somatic awareness. So you would feel and see the energy changing in awareness. You're that aware when you're doing this work. There's marker number 1. You want that marker there consistently each time you're doing rounds of inquiry in KI. The second marker is nervous system regulation. So when you're skillful at the repression barrier with trauma, you actually, through a round of inquiry, your system feels more regulated, not more anxious. So if you're feeling, you should feel consistently more regulated by KI, and consistently energy is transmuting, contractions transmuting to presence. Consistently. If you're not experiencing that, stop. If you're not experiencing both markers consistently, please stop. Because you can re-traumatize yourself around KI. What do we mean by that? See, what we're doing is we're stirring up old mind-body connections around buried anger or hurt. That's how we heal. But when we're not skillful yet, we're stirring the mind-body connection up, but we don't know how to turn awareness to it to make it fully conscious. So we've started up and our system is feeling that agitated. But again, we don't have the skill. So our system learns to be afraid or to be resistant to KI. So if you've been sitting there at home not doing KI, even knowing that it's a really good modality that can help you, it could be that you didn't gain the skill that you needed, like at 3D level, and therefore your system has shut you down around a modality that could have really helped you. Please, 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 I can't emphasize enough. You can leave KI if you don't watch for the 2 markers. Who wants to use something that would just re-traumatize their system and make you really resistant? I wouldn't want to use it. I always look for the 2 markers when I do KI. Okay, there's the inside out path, and just the last part of this is landing, and then I'm going to let you guys go. And I think this is going to be a good video for people. I hope you guys think that. I think it is. To help you get started in the understanding. Not the practice so much. That's going to take a bit. You're going to have to like sink your teeth into that a little bit. But landing is so important. It's like sabotage. They're concepts. Okay, and all concepts are just concepts. We can just get that over with right now. But sabotage and landing is how we do it to ourselves. So we stop inquiry practice. We sabotage it because we don't want to feel something and we don't have the skill level to meet that. And so our mind starts telling us that we're just too busy for KI or that we want to do something else, when what's really happening is the unconscious is trying to keep you safe again. So it shuts you down around this work, and then it tells you something else to keep you from going to the repression. Sabotage happens in so many different areas of life. It's not special here. But when it happens here, we have tools to meet it. So if you start sabotaging, you miss the opportunity. That's a form of suffering, sabotage. If you can bring KI to that form of suffering, imagine sabotage going away in all these areas of life. Can you even imagine that? What would that be like? Right? So, but if you don't, you stay stuck if you don't raise your skill level with sabotage. And then landing is a similar concept. It's kind of the same thing, but I've been pointing to it as happening when we go deeper into the path. So for example, if we're in third dimension, we're doing a lot of third dimension work and we're experiencing that embodiment of presence, but we get stuck. And let's say we sort of get to a place where we can't go somewhere in the body with something. We stop, or there's a lot of resistance to something in inquiry. And about the same time, we start engaging in a new or an old one, practice, pointer, point of view, perspective, or paradigm. The 5 Ps. Remember, landing on one of the 5 Ps. To stay safe or get love. And we don't know it. That's the thing about landing, is that if we only knew it, but we don't know it because it's unconscious. So why would we do it late in the path? Because it's protecting us, like all trauma programming. So how does it work? Like when I was doing the healing process with anger, repression, chronic pain, I would just be in my RV doing and feeling relief, like incredible relief, and be like, oh my God, this is amazing. Wow. And then like I would hit this patch in my spine and it would feel like, I don't want to say bone, because you can see an injury in my spine from an MRI. You can see several things. So I kept hitting something and I kept thinking, that's that bone or something. And I didn't know, but my mind just came in and said, that's what that is. And I noticed that then I couldn't inquire into that area of the body. It's like there was some conditioning there that was making me resist it. And at the same time, I heard myself saying, well, I think that's just physical. What's left? I've done a lot of great work, but what's left is physical. And that stopped me several times, actually, because I didn't have the skill. Remember, landing, increase your skill. If you can't get through a landing, it's a lack of skill. If there's a sabotage, it really is a lack of skill, guys. It's not to blame or judge the saboteur or whatever, but if you're not aware of that the lack of skill is how we do it. We just literally, we sabotage by not learning the skills that we need to move through a landing or a sabotage. But like with landing, see, now we have inquiries, now that we've developed KI, to spot that, to discover that when I'm saying my pain is physical, I want to go in and test that out in my body. See, nothing that I say or do, for me, I always check everything in the body, especially as a teacher now. If I say X is true, I go into my body to make sure there's no objection. There's no trauma, repression, trying to stay safe or get love by saying that, so that I can just stay true to what I'm doing. Just trusting the body totally, and as much as I can in relationship, because you can really trust it. But landing, see, it's hard to trust the body, because when you land, you already are landing because you don't want to feel something. And it's unconscious, so it just might be a contraction. And let's say, like I did, or pain, like I did, you start saying something like I did, it's physical. Now we have inquiry that shows you that you get something out of believing that. And what we get is safety and love. But here's safety, which means really that we're just afraid to express the anger, feel the anger or the sadness. We're just afraid. And we shut down around it in inquiry and in awareness. And then we start believing it's physical so that we won't go back in. That's how clever our system is with landing. Or I've seen people do this. They come deep and they learn these really advanced skills. They're simple, but they're advanced, and they get into the unconscious. And they experience so much freedom, but they hit again, it's always the same thing. You hit something and you don't have the skill to move through it. And then you sabotage by not learning the skill. So I've seen people hit that wall And then they go over to this like other practice. By the way that I feel about KI, you should be able to leave and come back freely. I have no energy around that. So you should, because that's how we learn. We learn by doing whatever we need to do and going wherever we need to go to find whatever works. And everybody should be autonomous and needs to be able to do that. And that's how I feel about it. So when you call me a call, please, please, please. Are you kidding me? I don't even like groups, really. And I don't really like followers. But I do like people who are earnest and like this work. So let's keep going. Sorry, I'm just being myself. Is that okay? I'm almost finished here. It's so important to understand that there's so possibility for landing. It keeps us from healing. It keeps us from really going all the way to the freedom. The embodiment, this isn't a time thing. It's not about story, getting somewhere. It's freedom that we deny ourselves by not seeing how we land on one of those 5 Ps, because we don't understand the reason that we're saying that or doing that new practice. Like I've watched people go to this new practice and then they don't realize they do that because they don't want to feel something that we're doing here. And if they would just come here, I would show them to feel, how to feel that and move through it. Then they can go to this other practice without using it as a bypass. And that's what I'm trying to do with KI, is just enjoy all these practices and these things, but become more skillful. And some people will just make KI their path, obviously. Okay, there's the inside out path. It feels complete. We can always say more. The work from here, if you resonate, is just to build your skill. Training, real quick, since I've done all this, I might as well say, I am looking for, if you, look, this is all, the rest of this is just training and mentorship stuff. So if you've already heard what you need and you don't want to bore yourself, move on for your own sake. And for the sake of all of us. I'm just kidding. I don't know what that meant. Training. The difference between, for me, these are the way that the programs that I have. There are other trainers here that might call it somewhat different. But we basically offer the same stuff, but different names right now. But mine are mentorship and training. And training is about becoming a facilitator. So training includes your own experience, like learning for yourself and learning to acquire your own experience. Training does. And it includes facilitating others, becoming certified to facilitate others. So training includes both of those components. Mentorship includes only your self-work. See, it doesn't include facilitating others. However, you can get into mentorship now, and there can be an add-on for training later at a lower cost than normal training if you just want to do mentorship now. Anyone can sign up for mentorship with me. Personal mentorship, it's one-on-one with me, personal sessions. We work together. I increase your skill. Each time we meet, I communicate with you between sessions some, and then obviously during the sessions, increase your skill. And through the end, my whole goal in mentorship is that your skill level is as high as mine or higher, so that you don't have to become dependent on me or be dependent on me or other teachers anymore, or even facilitators. However, you might still have people that you like to facilitate with or whatever. But that's what I think the freedom is about, is actually people being that free, where you actually are no longer dependent on others. Mentorship, that's what that's about. Anybody can sign up as long as mentorship enrollment is open. Whether it's open is my team will tell you that. So if you're interested in mentorship and you want to sign up right now, it could be open, but you don't know until you email support@killaby.com. That's the only email you would email them for everything that I do. So if you're interested in mentorship, email them and ask them about the pricing and everything. And you can sign right up if enrollment is open right now, and they'll tell you if it is. If it's not, you can be put on a waiting list, so that as I open enrollment up in the future, you'll get a notification that you can sign up if you want. Training, again, if it's open, same email, support@killaby.com. If it's open, there you can't just sign up. I'm pickier for people that I'm training to be facilitators because of all the bypassing and the teachers out there. I want to make sure that for training that we've got this down, right? Because I think that we could really have a whole new generation of teachers and coaches and trainers and even therapists if we really, really take the time to do this right with the training piece. So I'm pickier. I'm looking for more criteria there. For example, someone with somewhat of a regular practice who likes to this kind of stuff. Yeah, a regular practice of some sort. Some experience with KI repression work, even if it's 2D. Some experience with that, at least. 3D experience is great if you have that for training, and preferred, actually. Earnestness, which means you're the kind of person that when something happens in your life, you take it to inquiry. You actually want to process. You don't, when something bad happens, you might for a while sort of just avoid your emotions, but you want to actually turn towards stuff. Do you know what I mean? If you're the kind of person that's just really, really avoidant, training with me is not the place for you right now. There's a place for you in KI, but that's not, training with me is not it. We all are avoidant, but what I mean is some people just totally avoid spiritual practice and stuff, and they just numb out a lot around teachers and just sitting there and, watching videos and not necessarily investigating their own experience. And that's not the right candidate for KI right now, training. Another criteria for training is during the time that you're training can last up to a year. It's a deeply transformative process. You're working with others the whole time. It's not just me. Other trainees, other people. You want to have enough income each month separate from what we're doing here to support you during the training process. So, because otherwise people could get too anxious and make it about money. And although, yes, of course, my green check mark facilitators are busy. They're making money. They're making a living. But you can't put that first. Here, none of us do. It doesn't work that way. And so if you're somebody who's just wanting another modality of training to make money, it's not a right fit. You got to want to do this work first. And then you can make money just because you're enthused about it, because it's your passion, So if you're coming here because you're trying to make money, you're going to be too focused on the finish line, the certification. It's just not going to work. So please honor that that's the criteria that I'm asking for. Again, if you're interested in any of that, contact support@kiloby.com. Thanks, guys.